The bank thought they owned me. Until I found the one oversight that changed everything. I'm holding the legal titles they neglected to file, and their 42 missed calls won't fix their massive blunder. Step inside the room as we stand our ground and watch the bank's leverage vanish in real time. 42 missed calls. That's what my phone said when I finally looked at it again. Sitting on the kitchen table like a small glowing confession, screen lit up in that pale blue that makes everything in a dark room look like evidence. 42. I didn't need to listen to a single voicemail to know what they'd sound like. Because I'd heard the first 3 already, and I could feel the shape of the rest just from the pattern. The rhythm of a man realizing, in real time, that the ground under his feet wasn't ground at all. It was a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. Let me take you all the way back, further than you're expecting, because you need to feel this the way I felt it. Slow, and cold, and creeping, layer by layer, before you understand why I let that phone buzz itself into silence 42 separate times, and why every single one of those silences was earned, minute by minute, over 2 long years. I want to start with the smell of sawdust and hot metal, because that's what the first year of building something out of nothing actually smells like. Not the version people imagine when they hear the words small business owner. No glossy office, no motivational posters on exposed brick, no soft lighting. Just a rented warehouse on the industrial edge of town, with a roof that wept every time it rained hard. 3 buckets lined up in the corners, like some strange percussion section. Keeping time through the night, plink, 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 a rhythm I learned to sleep through the way other people learn to sleep through traffic. I financed everything through machines bought secondhand, because new was a luxury that belonged to somebody else's story, not mine. I remember standing in that warehouse at 2 in the morning once, watching my own breath fog faintly in the cold because heating cost money we didn't have yet, running my palm along the cool metal housing of a machine I'd bought off a liquidation auction, feeling the small vibration under my hand from the compressor 2 rooms over, and thinking, this is the tunnel, not the destination. I believed that with my whole chest. The bank believed it, too, at first. Or at least they performed belief well enough that I couldn't tell the difference. And for a long time, that performance was enough for me. I financed it all through one institution, one relationship manager, a man named Grant Holloway, who shook my hand so hard on the first day that I remember thinking he was trying to convince himself of something more than he was trying to welcome me. He had that particular tone bankers use with small business owners, warm on the surface, like a lake in July, sunlight scattered across the water, but underneath it, cold and moving, always counting, always measuring what could be extracted if the tide ever turned against you. For the first year, the tide didn't turn. Business grew the way scar tissue grows. Slow, uneven, ugly in places, but stronger exactly where it mattered. I made every single payment on time, sometimes early, because I wanted the record to speak for me before I ever needed it to. I sat across from Grant twice a year for what he called relationship check-ins, which really just meant him flipping through a manila folder of my numbers, while I watched his expression for any flicker of real interest and rarely found one. His eyes would move down the page, in that particular way. People's eyes move when they're reading without absorbing, and I'd catch myself talking louder, as if volume could fix attention. I told myself that was fine. I told myself banks don't need to love you. They just need to trust the paperwork. Here's the part I didn't understand yet. The part that would end up mattering more than anything else in this entire story. Paperwork isn't neutral. Paperwork is a living thing, and it either gets tended, carefully, deliberately, by someone whose job it is to tend it, or it rots quietly in a drawer somewhere, while everyone above and around it simply assumes someone else is watching. The recession that hit our sector came in slow, the way weather changes before a real storm. A stillness in the air first, a strange quiet in the order book that I noticed before I could name it, emails from clients that used to come daily arriving every 3rd day instead, then every 5th. Then it came in fast, 4 months. That's all it took to turn a stable, growing company into something that looked, on paper, like a company in free fall. Even though underneath the raw numbers I could see the shape of the recovery already forming, the way you can sometimes feel a fever, About to break even while your whole body still aches and your teeth still chatter. I called Grant early. I want that on the record clearly, and I want to say it slowly, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand that I did the responsible thing first, the thing every financial advisor in the world tells you to do. Get ahead of it. Communicate before it becomes a crisis. Don't wait until the wound is infected to finally show it to someone who could have stitched it closed in time. I sat in his office in my one good jacket, the one I kept folded in plastic for weddings and funerals, and now, apparently, for financial pleading too, and I laid it all out across his desk. Not vague, not emotional, not a man wringing his hands. Numbers. Spreadsheets printed and stapled in order, a recovery timeline built on real contracts already back in motion. Real clients already re-engaging, signatures already gathered. I asked for a restructuring, a temporary bridge, 90 days of breathing room, nothing more, nothing dramatic. He looked at me the way you look at something you've already quietly decided isn't worth saving. We'll monitor the account, he said. 4 words. I remember the exact temperature of that office. The recycled air, faintly metallic, tasting almost like a coin held too long under the tongue. The hum of a fluorescent light above his desk that flickered every 11 seconds like it was counting down towards something neither of us could see yet. I remember the sound of his pen clicking, open, closed, the entire time I talked, like my voice was background noise, competing against something more important happening privately behind his eyes. Maybe it was. Maybe he was already thinking about his next appointment, his golf game that weekend. Anything but the man sitting across from him holding his entire life's work out on a spreadsheet. Maybe, to him, I already was the next problem to be processed rather than a person to actually be heard. I warned him again a month later. Same office. Same flickering light. Though I swear that day it felt like it was flickering faster, more erratic. Like even the electricity in that building could sense something was about to fracture somewhere down the line. Same response, word for word, delivered with the same rehearsed calm, the same practiced tilt of the head that was meant to look like sympathy and instead looked like a man reciting a line he'd said so many times it had worn smooth like a stone in a river. I started to understand that this wasn't a decision being made about my specific situation at all. It was a script built for people exactly like me, designed to sound like reassurance while functioning quietly and efficiently as delay. Buying time not for my benefit, but for the bank's internal comfort, for a process that moved at its own pace, regardless of what was happening to the person standing in front of it. I warned him a 3rd time, and this time I brought more than numbers. I brought signed letters of intent from 2 clients confirming renewed contracts, physical proof, ink on paper, everything a reasonable institution would need to say yes to a simple bridge loan. I watched him flip through the pages without really reading them. The way you flip through a restaurant menu you've already privately decided not to order from, eyes skimming, mind elsewhere. He nodded in all the right places. He said all the right hollow words, the kind that sound complete in the moment and evaporate the second you're back in your car. And then, again, those same 4 words, like a door closing somewhere I couldn't see but could absolutely feel. I want to be honest about what that did to me. Sitting in that chair 3 separate times over 3 separate months. Because this isn't a story about triumph without cost, and I refuse to tell it like one. Each time I walked out of that building, I felt smaller than the time before. The lobby itself seemed almost designed for that exact purpose. Marble floors that amplified every footstep until you felt like the whole building was listening to you leave. High ceilings that made your voice feel insignificant the moment it left your mouth and rose up into all that empty air. Even the carpet in the upstairs offices chosen in some particular shade of gray that seemed to whisper, quietly, endlessly, you are a number, not a person. I'd sit in my car in the parking garage some days and just breathe for 10, 15 minutes before I trusted myself to drive, feeling that particular exhaustion that comes not from work, not from labor, but from being fully unseen by someone who had the power to see you clearly and simply chose not to. There was a night around that time I haven't talked about much, and I want to include it here because it belongs in this story, even though it isn't about the bank directly. I came home late from the warehouse, hands still smelling faintly of machine oil no matter how many times I washed them, and I sat down across from my wife at our kitchen table. The same table. Always the same table. It seems like every important thing in this story happens at that table. And I told her, plainly, that I didn't know if we were going to make it. Not the business. Us. The mortgage. The version of life we'd built around the assumption that things would keep working out because we worked hard enough for them to. She didn't cry. She just reached across and put her hand flat on top of mine, and she said, "Then we'll figure it out, together. Whatever it turns out to be." I think about that moment almost as much as I think about the 42 calls, because it reminds me what was actually at stake, underneath all the legal language and filing databases that come later in this story. It wasn't abstract. It was a family, a mortgage, a life, sittings in the balance while a man in a corner office clicked his pen. What Grant didn't know, what none of them knew, not him, not the director above him, not a single soul in that entire glass-walled building, was that back when we first financed the equipment, back in the scramble of the earliest days, when everything moved fast and every signature felt like a small miracle snatched out of thin air, there had been a clerical requirement that his own bank's legal team was responsible for completing. A UCC filing. I know that sounds impossibly dry, almost comedic in how unglamorous it is to be the hinge on which an entire story turns, but stay with me here, because this thread, this dry, bureaucratic, entirely forgettable thread, is the only thing that stood between a multi-million-dollar lender and their actual, enforceable legal claim over physical equipment worth more than most people's homes. Without that filing, done correctly, in the right jurisdiction, at the right time, a lender's claim to specific collateral isn't ironclad. It isn't even solid. It's smoke-shaped like a threat, and nothing more. I didn't know any of this yet. I found out the way most people find out the thing that changes their life. Sideways by accident, in a conversation I wasn't even supposed to be fully part of. My cousin is a paralegal. Nothing glamorous about it. No courtroom dramatics, no television version of the job. Just someone who spends her days elbow deep in filing systems most people never think about. The invisible plumbing that keeps commercial law quietly running underneath everyone's feet, without anyone noticing it's even. One night over dinner at her place, half venting, half just needing to say the stress out loud before it ate me alive from the inside, I mentioned the bank, the missed payment conversations, the collateral clause Grant kept dangling over me like a blade every time we spoke, reminding me casually, almost gently, almost kindly, that the equipment secured the loan, as if he were doing me a favor by reminding me of my own chains. She got quiet in a way that made me stop talking mid-sentence. She set her fork down. She asked me a strange question, one I'd never once thought to ask myself in 2 full years of doing business with that institution. She asked who actually held title to the machines. Not the loan agreement, not the promise on a signature, the actual filed legally recorded title. I didn't know. Why would I? You trust an institution with marble floors and 100 years of history hanging in framed portraits along its hallway to handle the boring, procedural things correctly. Because that's supposedly the entire foundation of their competence. The whole implicit contract. You sign the moment you walk through their doors. That's the illusion banks are built on. The quiet assumption that behind the warm handshake and the framed diplomas and the flickering fluorescent lights, someone, somewhere, in some back office you'll never see, is doing the tedious work flawlessly, so you don't have to think about it at all. She told me to check the state filing database. Just check it, she said, almost like an afterthought, already reaching for the salt. It'll only take you 10 minutes. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the very same table where, months later, I'd watch my phone shudder itself into an avalanche of 42 calls. The same table my wife had put her hand on top of mine on, and I searched, and searched, and found nothing. No lien, no filing, no record anywhere in any jurisdiction I could find, of the bank ever perfecting their claim on a single piece of equipment they had financed. Machines worth millions of dollars combined. Machines whose particular hum and rattle I knew as intimately as my own heartbeat by then. Machines that, on the paper that actually mattered. Not the paper sitting quietly in a drawer, somewhere in Grant Holloway's office, but the paper filed with the state, the paper that exists whether or not anyone remembers it. Worse still, legally, unambiguously, entirely mine. I want you to sit with the feeling I had at 2 in the morning, staring at a blank search result that somehow felt louder than any sound I'd ever heard in my life. It wasn't triumph. Not yet. It was something quieter and stranger. The feeling of standing in a room you'd been told, your entire life, had 4 solid, load-bearing walls, and suddenly realizing that one of them had never actually been there at all. You could have walked straight through it the whole time. Nobody would have stopped you. There was nothing there to stop you. You just didn't know to try. I didn't act on it right away, and I want that to be clear, because this was never a story about ambush. I'm not a reckless person, and honestly, this isn't even a story about cleverness. It's a story about patience, discipline, and about what happens when patience finally meets negligence head-on after 2 long years of one side refusing to listen. I found a lawyer, a real one, careful, meticulous, the kind of woman who reads every document twice and asks you 3 sharp follow-up questions for every single one you bring her, who doesn't let you finish a sentence with an assumption baked into it. I remember sitting across from her in her small, unglamorous office. Nothing like the marble lobby I'd grown to dread. Watching her scroll silently through the same database I had, her expression giving away nothing, professional to the last, until she finally looked up and said the words that would end up rearranging the next year of my life completely. "They don't have a secured claim on any of it," she said, setting her pen down deliberately. "Legally, right now, today, if they tried to seize that equipment, they'd be committing conversion. They'd be stealing from you. Stealing from me. The people who talked about my debt like it was a moral failing on my part. The people who clicked their pens through every warning I gave them like I was wasting their precious time. Legally, in the eyes of the very law they hid behind, they would be the thieves in this story, not me." I sat with that sentence for a long time after she said it, turning it over and over, feeling something shift permanently in how I understood the entire relationship I'd had with that institution for 2 years. And still, and I need you to really hear this part, I warned them one more time, one final time. I need you to understand this, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. It's the hinge everything else swings on. I gave them every single opportunity to be decent before I ever let their own arrogance become the instrument of their own downfall. I sat across from Grant Holloway one last time, in that same office, under that same flickering light, and I told him plainly, evenly, without a single ounce of drama in my voice, that the account was going to miss the next payment cycle, that I needed a real conversation this time, not a monitored account and a flickering light and a pen clicking open and closed like my entire livelihood, my family's entire future, was an inconvenience squeezed between 2 calendar appointments on his Outlook. He said the same 4 words. "We'll monitor the account," so I let them. I stopped pushing. I let the payment cycle pass, quietly, deliberately, the way you let a wave pull back out to sea before it comes crashing forward again with everything it's gathered. And I sat back and I waited, because I knew, with a certainty that felt almost peaceful, almost like the particular stillness right before dawn, when even the birds haven't started yet, that somewhere in that building, on some ordinary Tuesday morning, some junior officer in default services was going to pull up my file to authorize a seizure order on equipment they believed, with total unquestioning confidence, belonged to them, and they were going to search for something that had never existed, a ghost claim, a phantom lien, a promise on paper that was never once, in 2 full years, turned into actual, enforceable law. And that Tuesday came. And that's when my phone started ringing. The first call landed at 9:14 in the morning. I know that because I traced it all later, laid the entire timeline out like evidence across that same kitchen table, the way you'd trace a fever back methodically to patient 0. That first voicemail was almost funny in its calm. Grant's voice, smooth, professional, exactly the tone he used the day he shook my hand so hard I thought he was trying to prove something to himself. "Just touching base," he said, following up on the missed payment. "Nothing urgent. Give me a call when you get a chance." I could already hear it underneath the smoothness, if you knew where to listen. A tiny hairline crack, like ice testing its own weight before it splits open beneath someone's feet on a frozen lake. By call 6, the voice had changed. The pauses got shorter, more clipped, less rehearsed. The scripted warmth started slipping at the edges, the way a mask slips when the face underneath it has finally begun to sweat. By call 11, he wasn't alone in the room anymore. I could hear another voice bleeding into the background of one voicemail, muffled, urgent. Someone leaning into frame to ask him something he clearly didn't want to answer out loud. Something that made his own recorded voice stumble mid-sentence for the first time since I'd known him. A stutter I'd never once heard from that polished, rehearsed man. By call 14, I noticed something new in the tone, something I hadn't expected. A kind of pleading dressed up as professionalism. He used my first name 3 times in a message that was barely 30 seconds long, and each time he said it, it sounded a little less like a courtesy, and a little more like a man grasping for a handhold on a slope that had suddenly gotten steep beneath him. By call 19, it wasn't Grant at all anymore. It was someone from what they called asset recovery. A title that sounds clinical and bloodless right up until you understand what it actually means. People whose entire job description is walking into someone's life and physically removing things from it, and then calling the whole operation procedure, calling it policy, calling it anything at all except what it actually is at its core. I sat at that kitchen table, morning light sliding slowly into afternoon light across its surface, and I watched my phone light up again and again and again. And I felt something I hadn't fully prepared myself for, even after months of knowing this day was coming. Fear, first, a cold animal flicker of it, sharp and involuntary, 'cause even when you know, intellectually, that you're standing on solid legal ground, even when you have a lawyer's written confirmation, and a filing search you've printed out and folded into your desk drawer, there's a part of you that still remembers every single time an institution with more power than you has made you feel small under fluorescent light. That fear doesn't vanish just because the facts happen to be on your side. It just goes quiet, and it waits in the corner of the room, watching. Then, underneath the fear, something else slowly began to surface, rising up through it like heat through cold water. A stillness. Because I understood that phone vibrate itself steadily across my kitchen table, that I was witnessing something rare and strange in real time. An institution's entire architecture of control collapsing, piece by piece. And they didn't even know it yet. They were still operating on the old map, the one where they held every card, where a small business owner's fear was the only leverage they had ever actually needed to hold on to. They didn't know the map had changed completely underneath them, while nobody was watching. They were about to walk straight off the edge of a cliff that, according to their own outdated paperwork, simply did not exist at all. Call 22 brought a new voice entirely. Someone identifying himself only as being from compliance. A phrase that in that particular context sounded less like reassurance and more like a confession dressed carefully in a suit. His voicemail was careful, deliberate, every single word chosen with the precision of a man who already suspected the ground beneath his employer was unstable and was trying very hard not to say anything that could be used against them. Later, he didn't mention titles yet, not directly. But there was a pause in the middle of his message, right after the word dogmication, that lasted just a fraction too long, half a second longer than natural speech allows, and in that small, telling silence I could hear an entire department somewhere, quietly beginning to panic behind a closed conference room door. Call 24. Call 25. The messages started blurring together in tone, if not in content. Increasingly formal language wrapped around increasingly frantic subtext, the corporate equivalent of someone smiling through gritted teeth, while the room behind them slowly caught fire. Call 26 was the one where the mask fully came off, all at once, like it had been held on with nothing but tape the whole time. It wasn't Grant. It was someone higher. A director. Judging by the tightness coiled into every syllable, the practiced authority of a corner office pressed thin under real, unfamiliar strain, maybe for the first time in years. He didn't ask for a callback this time. He demanded a meeting, today if at all possible, this afternoon at the very latest. There's clearly been some confusion regarding the collateral documentation, he said. And I remember laughing out loud, alone in that kitchen, at the word confusion. Because that's what institutions always call it when their own negligence finally, inevitably, comes home to collect exactly what it's owed. Confusion. Not failure. Not malpractice. Not 2 full years, a basic legal requirement sitting untouched and unfiled in some forgotten drawer while people cashed their salaries anyway. Confusion, as though the universe itself had gotten muddled instead of them. As though some cosmic clerical error was to blame rather than a specific person, at a specific desk, who simply never did their job. By call 30, there was a new kind of desperation creeping steadily into the messages. Longer pauses, sentences that started and restarted mid-thought, the particular fumbling of someone trying hard to sound composed while every internal alarm they had was going off simultaneously somewhere behind their eyes. One voicemail, call 31, had almost 20 full seconds of near silence at the very start, just breathing. Just the faint ambient hum of an office somewhere deep in crisis, before the voice finally found any words at all. By call 34, there was no professionalism left to salvage, none at all. His voice had that raw, unraveling quality you only hear from someone standing right at the very edge of their own career, staring straight down into it with nothing left to break the fall. He said my name 3 times in a single voicemail, like he was trying to summon me bodily into the room, through sheer repetition alone. He said the word, irregularity, like it physically cost him something in his chest to say it out loud. He asked me to call back immediately, and then, almost as an afterthought, like it slipped out before he could stop himself, he said the sentence that told me absolutely everything I needed to know, the sentence I'd been waiting 2 years to hear. We need to discuss the title situation before this goes any further. The title situation, there it was. The open loop, snapping shut at last, cleanly, finally. The thing I'd known for months, sitting quiet and patient inside a state filing database, finally cracking wide open through the surface of their entire world. They'd gone to seize the equipment. They'd sent someone, probably some ordinary asset recovery officer just following standard procedure, expecting a routine collection, like 100 others he'd probably handled without incident, before, clipboard in hand, tow truck idling outside the warehouse. And instead of a straightforward seizure, he'd hit a wall that, according to every internal document they trusted implicitly, should never have existed. A legal wall, my wall, built not out of some clever scheme I engineered in secret, not out of some trick or technicality I'd manufactured in the dark, but out of their own failure. Sitting there patiently for 2 full years, untouched, unfiled, unforgivably ignored by people paid handsomely to make absolutely sure exactly this kind of thing could never happen. I let the phone ring through calls 35, 36, 37, letting each one pile onto the last, not out of cruelty. I want you to understand that clearly and completely, because this was never, at any point, a story about cruelty, but because I needed, for my own sake, to sit fully inside that moment before I answered it. I needed to feel the entire weight of what it meant to go from a man who was talked over in a fluorescent-lit office 3 separate times, whose warnings were reduced again and again to 4 dismissive words, to a man who was, for the first time in 2 years, finally, unavoidably, undeniably being heard. I wasn't gloating. Not really, not underneath it all. I was grieving a little, quietly, for the version of myself who had sat across from Grant Holloway, pleading to be taken seriously, who hadn't yet learned that some rooms only listen to leverage, and never, not once, to reason alone offered freely across a desk. Call 39 came from a number I didn't recognize at all. A landline with a different area code entirely. Regional headquarters, I'd learn much later. Someone even further up the corporate chain being pulled personally into a fire that had started as a small, easily ignorable spark 2 years earlier and was now threatening, very seriously, to reach the roof of the entire building. Call 40 came less than 4 minutes after that, almost too fast. Like whoever was dialing hadn't even fully hung up the previous call before starting the next. Call 41 was silent. No message left at all, just the bare record of the call itself sitting there in my phone's history, which somehow said more than words ever could have, a kind of desperate, wordless reaching that told me the panic had finally outrun their ability to even script a response to it anymore. Call 42 came at 6:52 that evening, almost 10 full hours after the very first one at 9:14 that morning. Almost 10 hours of a building somewhere across town, slowly discovering, floor by floor, department by department, meeting by frantic meeting, the true size of a hole they had dug for themselves 2 years earlier and then simply forgotten about, the way you forget about a small crack in a foundation, Until the day the whole wall finally gives way. When I finally called back, I didn't call Grant. I called the director directly, the one who had said, title situation, like a confession he clearly hadn't meant to make out loud in front of me. I kept my voice level, almost gentle, because I'd learned by then, through 2 long years of being on the losing end of calm, that calm carries further than anger ever does in a room like that. I told him I was available to meet, and I asked, politely but firmly, that legal counsel be present. Mine and theirs both. And I heard something shift in the silence on the other end of that line. Something small but unmistakable, that told me he already understood, on some level, just how far the ground had moved beneath his feet, while nobody there had been watching it happen. The meeting itself, I'll admit honestly, almost felt anticlimactic after everything that led up to it, which is often, I've come to learn, exactly how real justice actually feels. Quieter than you expect. Less like an explosion and more like one long, slow exhale after months of holding your breath, without even realizing you were doing it. We sat in a conference room this time. Not Grant's cramped little office with its flickering light, but a much bigger room with glass walls on 2 sides. The kind of room clearly reserved for problems that have stopped being routine and started being existential to the people involved. My lawyer laid out the filing history for them, page by page, month by month, 2 full years of a UCC filing that had simply, plainly, never existed at all. Their own legal counsel went visibly pale somewhere around page 3. I watched him lean over and whisper something urgent to the director beside him. Had the director's jaw tighten in that particular, unmistakable way a person's jaw tightens when the entire story they've told themselves about their own competence and their institution's competence, quietly, permanently, dies right there in front of everyone in the room. They tried, briefly, weakly, almost reflexively, to argue that the loan agreement itself implied a security interest regardless of the missing filing, grasping for whatever thin thread they could find. My lawyer let them finish every single word of it, patient as stone, not interrupting once, and then, calm as anything, she explained the difference between an agreement to grant a security interest and one that had actually, legally, been perfected. The difference, she said, looking directly at the director, rather than at his lawyer, between owning something on paper and owning it in the eyes of the actual law that governs what that paper means. Without perfection, without the filing that was their responsibility, and theirs alone, to complete 2 years earlier, their claim on the equipment wasn't just weak. It was nothing. Every machine, every tool, every hard-earned piece of hardware sitting in that warehouse belonged, unambiguously and entirely, to me. I watched 2 years of accumulated leverage evaporate in the space of about 11 minutes. Right there, under fluorescent light. No more patient than the light in Grant's office had ever been. Except this time it wasn't flickering over me while I pleaded. It was flickering over them, while they had absolutely nothing left to say. They didn't apologize. Institutions rarely do. Not really. Not in any way that actually means something to the person sitting across the table from them. What they offered instead was a restructuring. Suddenly miraculously available, the very thing I had begged for months earlier across that same desk and been told, again and again, simply didn't exist as an option. Suddenly there was flexibility. Suddenly there were options they'd apparently been sitting on quietly the entire time. Funny, in a bitter sort of way. How quickly an institution discovers compassion the exact moment it needs something from you instead of the other way around. I didn't take their restructuring. I want to tell you that clean. Without dressing it up into something nobler or more dramatic than it actually was. By then I'd already arranged financing elsewhere, with a smaller, community-based lender who, when I sat across from them and told them my situation honestly, laid everything out, just as plainly as I had for Grant 2 years earlier. Didn't click a pen or count seconds against a flickering light while I talked. They listened. They asked questions that showed they'd actually read what I gave them. That's the whole difference between the 2 rooms I sat in that year. When you strip away everything else. One counted. One listened. In the weeks that followed, word moved the way it always does in small business circles. Quietly at first, then all at once, the way a rumor spreads through a small town. Other clients of that same bank, people I'd never even met before, started reaching out, first cautiously, almost apologetically, then more openly, asking questions about their own financing agreements, about filings they'd never once thought to check, about titles they'd simply assumed were secure, because an institution with marble floors and 100 years of framed history had told them implicitly that it was. I didn't advise any of them directly. I'm not a lawyer, and I was careful never to pretend to be one. But I told them exactly what my cousin had told me over dinner that night, almost as an afterthought, the one sentence that ended up changing the entire trajectory of my life. Just check it. It'll only take you 10 minutes. Some of them found nothing at all and went back to their lives reassured. And honestly, that's exactly how it should work when an institution actually does its job the way it's supposed to. But a few of them found exactly what I found months earlier at that same kitchen table under that same pale glow of a laptop screen. Silence where there should have been a filing. An assumption where there should have been law. A gap 2 years wide that nobody in a position of power had ever bothered to close. And I think about that more than almost anything else now. More than the satisfaction. More than the quiet, eerie thrill of watching an institution's arrogance collapse under the full weight of its own negligence in a glass-walled room. I think about how many other people out there, right now, tonight, are sitting across some desk from their own version of Grant Holloway, being handed 4 hollow words instead of the truth, never once imagining that somewhere in a dusty, overlooked corner of bureaucracy, the ground beneath the person threatening them might not be nearly as solid as it looks from where they're sitting. So here's what I carry out of all of this, the thing that stays with me longer and heavier than the satisfaction ever did, longer even than the quiet thrill of watching that leverage disappear in real time. It's this. Power built on someone else's fear is never as solid as it looks from the outside. It survives only for as long as the person underneath it doesn't know exactly where the ground actually is. Grant Holloway, and everyone above him in that chain of command, weren't defeated by some brilliant scheme I engineered carefully in the dark. Whatever the more dramatic version of this story circulating out there might want you to believe. They were defeated by their own refusal, repeated 3 separate times across 2 years, to do the boring, unglamorous, procedural work of simply taking a frightened small business owner seriously when he sat down in front of them and told them, plainly, that something was about to break. Defeated by 4 words, said over and over like a spell that eventually stopped working. We'll monitor the account, instead of one real conversation, offered back when it still could have meant something to both of us. When it still could have saved everyone involved a great deal of pain. I don't tell this story so that anyone listening goes off digging through filing databases, hope desperately to find some loophole that saves them the way one saved me. That's not the lesson here, and, honestly, it would be a small hollow thing to take away from all of this if it were. The lesson is bigger than that, and it's simpler than that too. It's this. When someone comes to you scared, holding their hands out, telling you plainly and honestly that something is about to break, listen to them like their future depends on it. Because sometimes it does, and sometimes, whether you realize it in the moment or not, yours does too, and you won't always get the warning a second time, let alone a third. I gave them 3 warnings, spread across 2 years, delivered as calmly and clearly as I knew how. They only ever needed to really hear one. Somewhere out there is a version of this story where Grant Holloway actually looked up from his desk the very first time I sat across from him in that flickering light, actually heard the fear underneath my voice instead of measuring it silently against a folder full of numbers. And none of this. Not the 42 calls stacking up on a kitchen table. Not the pale-faced lawyer going quiet somewhere around page 3. Not a single piece of any of it would have ever needed to happen at all. That's the story I think about the most, even now, long after the warehouse roof got fixed and the buckets finally came down from the corners. Not the one where I won. The one where nobody needed to lose anything in the first place, if only somebody, anybody, in that whole marble-floored building had simply, finally, taken the time to listen.